quick review from the first part of the notes. 2 reasons why the Western half declines. You have internal conflicts from the military, politics, economics, social issues, and you also have outside invasions from those Germanic tribes. Remember the role of Attila the Hun. The Huns are pushing into Eastern Europe from the Asian steppes, and they're pushing into an area owned by the Germanic tribes. Those Germanic tribes are unable to fight off the Huns, so they accept protection by the Romans. Now the Romans in exchange are going to make those Germanic tribes serve in the military. Romulus Augustus is the guy who was the last Roman emperor to actually occupy Rome. Byzantium is the eastern half of the Roman Empire. So that half of the Roman Empire is going to flourish and continue for another 1,000 years after Rome falls apart. They are responsible for the saving of the knowledge that we have of the Greeks and the Romans. They kept records in Greek. They spoke Greek, not Latin. They are going to record everything down. Later, we are able to pull up that knowledge that they've saved because we can translate the Greek. Okay, Justinian. We call him the dude in Byzantium. He's born a peasant near what is modern-day Croatia, and he, goes through the whole process of raising through the ranks and eventually becomes emperor. We call him the dude because this guy is like mega important. He is going to write a book called the Digest. What the Digest is an 800,000 word codification or collection of over 1,500 Roman law books. Kind of shrinks it into the Roman law for dummies. And that book gets used in what we call the Institute. Justinian is also going to create the Institute. It's like a curriculum for law schools throughout the empire. The big question is, why are the Digest and the Institute so important? They're important because they create a system where the law is the same throughout the entire land. The Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea is important because Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, is going to call a meeting. And the purpose of this meeting is to reorient the Christian church into something under his control. And to also get the Christians to kind of all believe the same thing. There's some kind of differing tales of what's going on. The reason why Constantine's Council of Nicaea is so important is that it's one of those big marker events. It marks the start of what we call the Eastern Roman emperors having control over the faith. This is not going to happen in what had been the former western half of Rome. The western half of Rome is weak. There's no emperor to control church leaders. So church leaders become the central power. And that is why the Pope is almost like a king over religion. There's no political leader over him. The Council of Nicaea is really the marker event of the split of the Catholic Church. We call that the Great Schism. I love that word, schism. Great Schism is when you have a split. The issues between East and West are more than just religion. Way of life, culture is going to be different. Politics are going to be different. So the culture in the western half is very rural. Most people are farmers. Their heritage tends to be those Frankish or German ancestry. And they speak Latin. There's a lack of central political power after the fall of the western half. So there's no real check on the Pope's power. This is going to allow the Pope to claim to be the supreme religious authority over all Christians. Politic-wise, Rome, the religious Rome, is going to become the centralizing or connecting feature. What draws Europe together is going to be religion under the guidance of a Pope. The eastern half, instead of farms, you've got these large cities. They don't speak Latin, they speak Greek, and they've got a very Greek heritage. When it comes to church doctrine, it's going to largely be led by an emperor. That emperor is going to appoint and direct that head of the church, the patriarch. So politically, the church is not going to have power over government in the East, but it will as time goes by in the West. Okay, speaking of feudalism, or speaking of the western part of the Roman Empire, let's talk about what happens after Rome falls apart and how feudalism develops and what life's like there and kind of how people still remain linked. Remember those social classes in Rome, the patricians who were those rich landowning upper class, and those peasants, those plebeians who were farmers? What's going to happen is those patricians are going to continue to buy land. They're going to continue to have the money and the power even after Rome falls apart. But the plebeians are no longer going to have the protection of the Roman army. So as foreigners invade, they're going to be looking to those wealthy landowners to protect them. So the solution to this problem is the peasants give their land to wealthier landowning people in exchange for protection. If a peasant is able to hold on to some of that land, maybe they got rid of just most of it, then they're a peasant. They have the opportunity to leave later on. But if they give up all their land, or they were too poor to give any land to start with, they become part of the role of the serf. A serf is not a slave in the sense that they can be separated from families or sold away to somewhere else. A serf is tied to the land. If the land changes hands, the serf changes hands. The serf never leaves. It stays with the land. The knights grow out of that proletariat group, those warrior groups. A knight is going to fight on behalf of their lord in the hopes of gaining some land as a reward. So what's daily life like? Well, it depends on what social class you're in. If you're one of the upper class, those monarchs, lords, and ladies, the former patricians, you were going to oversee the land and kind of manage the people who work on them. If you were part of the proletariat that became knights, you're going to continue to hone your warrior skills. You're going to go through a lifetime of training. You're going to serve the nobility in the hopes. Oh my gosh, that was my husband singing in the background. You're going to go through years of training and eventually serve the nobility in the hopes of making some money and some land for yourself. If you're one of the peasants, you're doing all the work. You're laboring to farm the land, you're making cloth, you're butchering animals, you're basically the background of society. So what becomes the role of the church? Well, without a single emperor to rule the empire, the church kind of takes on the role of being the unifying factor. They're going to do this by encouraging sacraments and pilgrimages. Okay, the sacraments of the Middle Ages were sacred rites that Christians believed brought them a special blessing from God. And some of these are still in practice today, like the concepts of baptism and marriage. And if people are practicing Catholicism, they still go through all 7 of them. But in the end, the idea of the sacraments is that they mark the most important occasions in a person's life. The timing of these is historically kind of interesting. Baptism always happened about 3 months along, still today in the modern traditions of these ancient versions of Christianity. And the reason why is if the babies lasted past the first 3 months, they were probably going to live into childhood. So then there's confirmation, and that kind of happened, modern day, about 10 to 12 years old. If a kid made it that far, they were making it towards adulthood. So, gotta bless them again. Then you keep going. At each major point in a person's life, it's a big deal. So you wanted the church to celebrate that. Pilgrimage became the other piece of it. Religious faith led a lot of people to extraordinary acts of devotion, and pilgrimage is probably the most familiar example of it. People would travel these long distances to visit holy sites and visit churches that housed relics. Relics are objects considered to be holy because it either belonged to or was touched by some holy person. And it became really popular in the Middle Ages to visit a church that had like the finger bone of St. Paul. So how does this affect the church? Well, it gives them power. If people are traveling hundreds of miles on foot just to visit a sacred relic, that shows you how powerful the church really is. And then the church is taxing people to fund the system. So it's making money too. So the church throughout the Middle Ages gains a lot of political influence and power because there's no way you're going to become king of some area without the backing of the church.